Hi folks, with Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. Please listen to this presentation as you would a radio broadcast. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the new focus that the Trump administration's having in the US on military capability or fighting capability, the ability to fight, prosecute, and win wars, whether it's in defense of the United States or projecting power beyond US borders. Now, the previous several years of the activity in the US defense sector has been to encourage things like equity programs with transgenders and lesbians and have homosexuals with wearing dresses running up and down, these sorts of things, cross-dressing and the like. And the idea of military capability appears to have been almost non-existent. It became the military became an ideological plaything for the social justice grifters and hustlers and so on, social engineers. And the idea of prosecuting, winning wars seemed to be, we'll think about it later. We'll deal with that later. Now, in order to have all these equity programs, of course, standards had to be lowered, as they have been in every field of endeavor and every undertaking all across the Western world. Standards had to be lowered and lowered and lowered in order to get the equity outcomes. I remember this from high school when they said that girls could in certain subjects, not all, but in certain subjects, girls could get were given a 50% boost to their grades, just to create this sense of equity. Boys used to come first in everything at school then, so if a girl got 40% or something in an exam, which would be a fail, they would just double it to 80 and say, look, she came first. It was that, even back then, it was that crazy. Now that was just starting as I was finishing high school. That was just starting, that madness, but it's crept into everything. So in the case of selecting recruits for the military service, if they held a standard, there'd be hardly any woman would ever meet it. The odd one here or there maybe, but hardly any. So they just lower the standard, keep on lowering the standard for your fitness and all this sort of stuff. Keep on lowering the standard until they achieve the desired ideological equity goal they're pursuing. Now, this is obviously not a winning formula or strategy for warfare. Now, grounded warfare is probably changing. The idea of masses of frontline troops, how it used to be that masses of boots on the ground duking it out and shooting at each other in close quarters, that's unlikely to be as big a factor as it once was. Even though if we look at the Ukraine war, where masses of Western and US technology, some of it a bit older, by the way, as in the previous generation of military technology, has been sent over to the Ukraine, and it's a bit difficult to determine exactly what effect it's had, and because Russia's got their advanced technology as well, but Russia wasn't putting everything into the conflict. They could have mass mobilized and really hit it hard. They didn't do that, so you got to wonder whether both sides are thinking they can play a game of attrition on the other. But anyway, that technology came in. But in spite of that technology, and a lot of it, American technology going to Ukraine, there was still boots on the ground, was still playing a significant role. Now, this is of course two countries that are adjacent to each other. You just got to walk across the border, and that's a very different story when you've got to say cover go across numerous other countries first and cover vast distances in the process, because then your logistical machine situation totally changes when you have to do that. If you have to supply troops and so on right next to your border that are only a few miles away, that's one thing. But when you have to move that logistical machine hundreds of miles across numerous other territories, some of which may even be hostile or difficult and inhospitable, that sort of thing, then that's a completely different ballgame. Similarly, if you're trying to do an invasion or project military power across large bodies of water. And I'm not talking like the English Channel of 20 miles or something like that, but say China wants to invade Taiwan, for example, then that's quite a lot of water you got to cover. So the sheer logistics of being able to not only launch an attack but support it in the field with all the equipment and bits and pieces, that is a massive logistical undertaking, and one that requires not only resources and facilities, but absolute expert planning. You can't fuck up something like that. Coming back though to the US capability, now Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth is, according to his press releases at least, is doing away with all this social justice nonsense and say, look, this is the military. Our job as the military is to successfully fight, prosecute, and win wars, which indeed it is. I mean, there's no go. But Secretary Hegseth's in a good position because there is no way he could fuck it up, and he felt like it is already at the lowest of the low bars. Idiots like Milley and Austin and so on. I mean, fuck me. And so Hegseth's got nowhere to go but up here, and so, but nonetheless, there'd be a lot of people installed in that department who would be there would fancy themselves as the resistance, that would be there to frustrate and resist and hamper and slow walk anything he wants to do. So he's going to have to get in the middle there and get his hands dirty and get it happening, and have I think to be just get rid of anybody who's any officer or so on, and say, look, you've got certain capabilities. And we would like to keep you, but if you're against this is the agenda. If you're against this, then we'd like you to leave. If you want to be on board with it and you want to bring your capabilities, assuming the officer in concern has any capabilities. I mean, a lot of the affirmative action women who've been hired as officers or promoted as officers, most of them have to go. They're not there on any form of merit, or any minorities and so on. Some will be there on merit, a small number of them, but most won't be. So, these are things that Secretary Hegseth is going to need to address. But I just want to go back in time. If you look at the Americans prosecuting the war in, say, Vietnam, now it's cited as a defeat, the Vietnam War, in as much as the Americans didn't win, and thus it's by extension a defeat. Depends sort of how you look at it, but the reason being is the American military inflicted somewhere in the order of, and I hope I've got the numbers right here, maybe someone can correct me if I'm wrong in the comments, but the American military inflicted something in the order of 2 million casualties on the North Vietnamese, and where they sustained, in terms of dead and injured, 150,000 or something. So they're doing 13, 14 to 1 or something, I think is the ratio. So you'd say, well, if you're inflicting that many casualties on the enemy, and that 14 to 1 type ratios, then and many of the injured, the American injured, sort of recovered, but just from better medical care and swifter evacuations, that sort of stuff, then you'd say, well, gee, that's a victory, isn't it? But the determination and ability of the North Vietnamese and the casual disregard their government had for civilian casualties or casualties in their military, you look at that and say, well, what was it really a defeat? If the enemy is prepared to engage in what in effect is almost self-destruction in the interest of winning, means they're driven, of course, ideologically rather than practically, then have they achieved a victory at all? I would argue that it was such a hollow victory for the Vietnamese that it wasn't a victory at all. Nonetheless, now I'll go back to those days when I was just a little kid, little punk ass kid, not long out of kindergarten. But I do remember in Australia, I think it was about 1970, I think around there, there was a new president I think it was Nixon, 69 maybe. I think Nixon was president, and there was a new prime minister in Australia. So he went over to America to get President Nixon to sign and like a defense agreement that America would come to Australia's aid if Australia was attacked. China at the time was doing quite a lot of sort of saber rattling and a lot of get tough type language was coming out of China back at the time. Some of it was pretty hollow. I mean, they didn't really have the capacity to do half the things they were talking about. But nonetheless, there was the jitters here in Australia. It was a population of, I don't know, 10 million or something. So, so the Australian Prime Minister went over to, and Nixon signed the Defence Treaty or whatever it was. And this was a huge deal. Now, but bear in mind, this is the Cold War, and there's paranoid fear about communists everywhere. There's all sorts of things there. But a small country with a very minimal defence capability was looking to America that had a very large defence capability. And again, the Cold War sort of stuff going on. But so when the Prime Minister came back, suddenly all the TV stations suddenly all doing address to the nation. Prime Minister addresses the nation. I have been to America. The President has signed the Defence Treaty. And then it cuts to the the American Pacific Fleet, bristling with kick-ass weapons and this sort of stuff. And this was to assure the public, we're being looked after here. These guys won't let anything happen to us, and this sort of thing. And the American military capability was held up as being, the gold standard. You fuck with America, you are going to be in serious, deep shit. So this was and it was all very dramatic. Address to the nation, and as a kid, you used to look at, oh, this sounds really heavy. Oh wow. But the idea is, or the understanding was that the American military capability was such that nobody would dare fuck with them. I mean, why would you want to fuck with the military with that sort of, and not simply a they're well trained or something like that, but the technological capability and the sort of comments that American generals would make, or military people would make, we'll bomb them back into the fucking Stone Age, and this sort of thing. So the gold standard of military capability and the ability to project that, through a fleet and boots on the ground, someone was such. Now the war today, if we look at, say, the role of drones, and so that someone can be sitting in an office or a building in Washington, so somewhere in the US, directing and controlling drones that may be a continent away. So there's going to be warfare in the space with satellites, monitoring, observation, drone control, missile control via satellites. So there's the war in space there. That's going to, the Chinese claim they've got satellites that can go and throw grappling hooks on other satellites or laser beam them to screw up their comms. And I don't know whether that's true or not. We'll find out one day. But the whole idea of warfare has, through technical evolution, has changed. And I imagine there'll be less reliance, and again, unless they're adjacent areas, countries next to each other, I think there'll be much less reliance on boots on the ground and much more reliance on things like drones, satellite laser beams, all that sort of type of stuff, the very high tech end of it. Similarly, anti-missile defense systems. So there's a whole shitload of missiles come screaming in from wherever, and if you've got the best missile defense system to knock out the incoming missiles, then you've already got a huge advantage. I think that those sort of technologies are going to be the thing. Now, something that in warfare always takes people by surprise is that in the most advanced, technically advanced, industrial nations, if you knock out the electricity and the water and this and that, the next thing, you've effectively, completely neutralized the country. It can't operate. It's fucked. But in a less sophisticated country, then that doesn't have the same effect. this talk about we'll bomb the Afghanistan, people back into the Stone Age, but they're already in the fucking Stone Age. What exactly are you going to knock out there? What exactly are you going to bomb that's going to affect them? I mean, next to nothing. So, but in an advanced economy, then it does have a big effect. When the German armies were advancing through the Soviet Union, Soviet Russia in World War II, they thought knocking out, dams and electricity and this and that, and capturing power tools and closing factories and capturing locomotive, they thought if we capture what we think or what we see as the modern infrastructure, we can completely sort of neutralize their capability. Now, had that happened in Germany, it would have, or had it happened in a very advanced industrial economy, but the Soviet Union wasn't an industrial economy in the same way that Germany or Britain or France or something was at the time. In addition to that, their assets were widely spread over a wide geographical area rather than concentrated. So the bombing and the this and that didn't have the same effect, didn't have the same neutralizing effect. And this quite perplexed the German planners and military tacticians. They thought things like knocking out the electricity grid in an area, they thought that would have a much bigger effect than it ended up doing. So when we look at also the warfare that we can assume that's on the horizon and coming along, it's going to depend on not only the application of technology, but the vulnerability to technological reduction in the country that's being attacked. America is very vulnerable to having its infrastructure knocked out, but China is much less vulnerable to that. Not that it isn't vulnerable at all, it's just much less vulnerable. So the relative pain that will be suffered through infrastructure destruction in the United States would be very different if you apply it on a relative basis to somewhere like China or other places. I think there's another thing too to consider, the idea of saboteurs. During days of nationalism and times when loyalty to your country was important, there weren't many. Not the sabotage wasn't an issue; it was, but the idea of sabotage on a large scale wasn't then. Now, if we look today, the Indians and Chinese and all these sort of people, they're even if they're born in Australia, are born in the West, their loyalty, as they see, still is to the genetic, the country of their genetic origin, to China or India or Pakistan. They still see that as their loyalty. There was a recent British politician was elected in a local area, and she spoke in Pakistani, Urdu, spoke in Pakistani, saying that she's a proud Pakistani and she represents the people of Pakistan. She was born in England and has been given a job as a political, a taxpayer-funded political operative in England, and says her priority is to represent Pakistan. I mean, fuck, how would we allow that? Would the reverse be allowed? Could somebody from England go into the middle of China and say, "Oh, yeah, I'm representing the people of England"? I mean, the Chinese wouldn't put up with it for 1 second. So there's this vast army of people in the West now, mass migration, who their loyalty is to their again, the country of their genetic diaspora. Now, these people cluster around city areas, particularly, say, transport hubs, bus or rail or whatever, interchange near airports, that sort of thing. And they could almost control those areas. So if you wanted to I think the next area or an area of concern is a mass saboteur class that you couldn't round them all up and put them in camps. There were just too many of them. You just couldn't do it. I mean, how do you stop these people from being, you just shoot everyone on sight of them. You can't do that either. There's too many of them. So in fact, there's a mass phalanx of saboteurs, potential saboteurs at the very least, all across the West now. And they're saboteurs that do not exist in these other countries. There's not a mass saboteur class in India or China or somewhere. It's only in the West. And that also needs to be, I think, a dimension of modern warfare. But in terms of Secretary Hegseth in the United States focusing on, with the full support of the overall Trump administration, focusing on military capability and the ability to fight and win wars. Well, of course, what else does the military exist for? It doesn't exist for so gay people can ponce around in dress. It doesn't exist for that. It exists to deliver military capability, and so it should. You've been with Tacitus today, your Pushback channel. Thank you for listening.